Episode titled Lost Words. The morning began normally. Mummy Pig was making breakfast. Daddy Pig was sitting at the table with a newspaper. Peppa came downstairs, and George was playing on the floor with his dinosaur. Everything seemed calm. Mummy Pig placed the plates on the table and said, "Breakfast is re..." She stopped and frowned, as if she had forgotten the last word. Peppa looked at her. "Did you mean ready?" Mummy Pig smiled and nodded. Daddy Pig said that sometimes mornings started too early. Everyone sat down at the table. George lifted his dinosaur and said, "Dino." Then he stopped. He looked at the toy as if he could not remember its name. Peppa laughed, but the laugh quickly became quieter. Something felt wrong. After breakfast, Peppa went to play with George in the living room. She picked up a block and said, "Let's build a..." But the word disappeared. She knew what she wanted to say. She could see it in her mind, but she could not speak it. George held out his dinosaur and opened his mouth, but only a small sound came out. Peppa ran to Mummy Pig. In the kitchen, Mummy Pig was looking at a shopping list. There were words on the paper, but some letters had vanished. Instead of milk, there was only meat. Instead of apples, only a few letters remained. Mummy Pig touched the page with her finger, but the letters did not return. Daddy Pig came over with his newspaper. He tried to read the headline, but the words on the page slowly spread apart and became empty lines. The house became strangely quiet. At first, everyone still tried to speak. Peppa used short phrases. Mummy Pig replaced words with gestures. Daddy Pig pointed at objects and tried to remember their names. But with every hour, there were fewer words. Simple things no longer had names. A cup became only an object on the table. A door became something that opened. A window became a bright square in the wall. Peppa walked up to George and quietly said, "George?" He lifted his head, but he did not answer. Then Peppa understood that he had forgotten even his favorite word. He held the dinosaur, but he no longer called it anything. His eyes looked confused. Peppa wanted to say that everything would be all right, but she could not remember the word right. By evening, the family sat in the living room. The television was off. No one wanted to turn it on, because even the names of the shows might disappear. Mummy Pig opened her mouth, but said nothing. Daddy Pig wrote something on a piece of paper, but the words vanished under the pencil. Peppa looked at the blank page and felt her mind becoming quieter. Then the names disappeared. Peppa looked at Mummy Pig and suddenly could not name her. She knew that this was the closest and warmest voice in the house, but the word was gone. Daddy Pig looked at Peppa and tried to say her name. His lips moved, but the room remained silent. At night, Peppa woke up. There was not a single sound in the house. She went into the hallway and saw that the words on the family drawings were gone. Even the letters in the books had become empty lines. In the living room, the whole family sat together. They looked at one another and said nothing, not because they did not want to speak, because there were no words left. In the morning, everything looked ordinary. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen. Daddy Pig sat with his newspaper. George held his dinosaur. Peppa opened her mouth to say good morning, but she could not remember a single word. Then, from the turned-off television, a quiet voice spoke the first word of the day, "Peppa," and the whole family slowly turned toward the screen. Episode titled Cursed Fridge. It was a normal morning in the Pig family house. Mummy Pig was making breakfast. Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Peppa was playing with George, when Peppa noticed a strange corner of the kitchen. In it stood a refrigerator she had never seen before. It was tall, old, with a dark metal door slightly flickering in the morning light. Peppa approached and sniffed it. The smell was strange, cold, and slightly sweet. Curiosity took over. Peppa opened the door and a blast of cold air hit her. Inside it was dark, but she saw a small glowing space, as if the refrigerator was not a normal fridge, but a tiny tunnel. She leaned in, and suddenly the door slammed shut behind her. Peppa tried to open it, but the handle was heavy, as if some magical force was holding her inside. Peppa started to panic. She pushed, pulled, but the door wouldn't budge. The light inside the refrigerator was strange, changing from bright blue to dim red. Peppa saw her reflection on the wall, but it was slightly wrong. The eyes were wider and the smile too large. Peppa shivered and stepped back. Inside the fridge, the space seemed bigger than it should be. Boxes and bottles were arranged like a narrow corridor. Peppa walked forward, and the corridor stretched endlessly. Occasionally, she heard faint creaks and rustles, as if someone was walking nearby. But when she turned, no one was there. She called, "Mummy! Daddy! George!" But her voice echoed and disappeared into the strange space. She found a small door deeper inside the refrigerator. She opened it and entered an even stranger section, darker, with heavy air. Peppa felt the refrigerator watching every movement. She tried to go back, but the path had vanished. It seemed the fridge itself was changing the corridors, trapping her. Time inside became distorted. Clocks on the walls spun too fast or slowed down completely. Peppa felt tired but kept walking, searching for an exit. Suddenly, she saw a small light at the end of the corridor. She ran toward it, hoping for freedom. When the light reached the door, Peppa pushed it hard and emerged into the kitchen. The refrigerator was in its place, but looked old and normal. It no longer flickered. Peppa sat on the floor, catching her breath. Mummy Pig came over and hugged her. "Peppa, what happened?" she asked. Peppa could not explain at once. She only stared at the refrigerator. It seemed to flicker slightly in the corner again. Her heart was racing. She knew this strange refrigerator was not ordinary, and she understood that some things in the house are better left alone. Episode titled Peppa's Creepy Wings. It was a normal morning in the Pig family house. Mummy Pig was making breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper, George played with his dinosaur, and Peppa was sitting at the table drawing. Everything seemed calm until Peppa felt a strange tingling in her back. She turned around and saw tiny, transparent wings sprouting from her shoulders. "Oh!" Peppa gasped. She touched the wings. They trembled and shimmered in the morning light. George walked in and immediately noticed them. "Peppa, what is that?" he asked. "I don't know," Peppa replied. "They just appeared." Mummy Pig came closer and looked carefully. "Peppa, this is unusual," she said. "Be careful, don't fall." But the wings kept growing, at first small, then long enough to almost reach the floor. Every time Peppa took a step, the wings swayed slightly, and a soft whisper seemed to echo her name. Peppa tried to lift them. At first, nothing happened, but when she waved her arms, she almost lifted off the ground. A gentle breeze ruffled her hair. George watched in amazement. "Peppa, this is strange," he said. Peppa felt uneasy. The wings began to move her slowly forward as if they wanted to take her somewhere. She tried to stop, but her feet felt stuck to the floor. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig tried to help but couldn't touch the wings. They were cold and transparent, like thin glass. "Peppa, what do you feel?" asked Mummy Pig. "It's strange," whispered Peppa. "They seem like they want to fly." Peppa stepped back carefully, and the wings immediately spread, lifting her slightly above the floor. She felt dizzy. George grabbed her hand. "Peppa, hold on!" The wings began to flap slowly on their own. The room filled with a quiet sound of air cutting through space. Peppa realized that this was not just about growing wings. It was the start of something new, unusual, and slightly frightening. By evening, the wings had shrunk a little but were still visible. Peppa couldn't hide them under her clothes. She looked in the mirror and saw her reflection with transparent wings. Mummy Pig explained that it might be temporary, and they should watch over them. At night, Peppa woke. Her wings trembled slightly and glowed softly in the dark. She walked to the window and looked outside. The garden's shadows moved quietly, and a light breeze wrapped around her wings. She realized that tomorrow the wings might carry her to unusual places again, and that every step with them would be a small adventure. Episode titled, The Strange Shop. It was a normal morning. Mummy Pig was making breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper, Peppa came downstairs and said, "Good morning," and George was playing with his dinosaur on the floor. After breakfast, the family decided to go to the city. Outside, everything felt calm. Shops were opening and people were walking along the street. Peppa held George's hand while he carried his dinosaur. As they walked, Peppa noticed a small shop standing slightly apart from the others. The sign above it was faded and the words were hard to read. The door was slightly open. Peppa said she wanted to take a look. Daddy Pig agreed, but said it would be quick. They stepped inside. The shop was quiet. The shelves were filled with toys. There were dolls, cars, and soft animals. Everything looked new, but there was no shopkeeper. Peppa picked up a toy. It felt nice to hold. She placed it back. George walked to a shelf and placed his dinosaur next to the other toys. He said, "Dinosaur," and looked at them. Then he got distracted and walked away. A minute later, he came back. His dinosaur was gone. He looked at the shelf again. There were many similar toys, but none of them were exactly his. George started looking around. He walked between the shelves and quietly repeated, "Dinosaur." Peppa helped him search. It felt like there were more toys than before. Some of them looked familiar. She looked closer and realized they resembled toys children had been holding outside. Daddy Pig said it was time to leave. George did not find his dinosaur and they left the shop. Outside, everything seemed normal again. But Peppa turned back for a moment. In the shop window, there were toys on display. Among them was George's dinosaur. It stood still. Peppa said nothing. In the evening, George sat at home and played with a new toy. It looked similar to his dinosaur, but slightly different. He quietly said, "Dinosaur," but sometimes paused, as if waiting for a response. At night, Peppa woke up. She thought she heard a sound from the hallway. She stepped outside and saw toys on the floor. There were more than during the day. Among them was George's dinosaur. It lay slightly apart from the others. Peppa did not pick it up. In the morning, everything seemed normal. There were fewer toys again. George was playing and smiling. But when Peppa looked at the shelf, it felt like one toy was missing. Episode titled, Creepy Copies. It was a normal morning at the Pig family house. Mummy Pig was cooking breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper, and Peppa was playing in her room. Suddenly, she noticed something strange in the kitchen. She walked over to the door, peered inside, and froze. There, standing at the table, was a copy of herself. "Peppa!" Mummy Pig called out, but Peppa didn't respond as her copy smiled and took a step aside, mimicking her every move. "Mum!" Peppa shouted, but when she turned around, the copy had disappeared. Peppa thought it must have been her imagination. She returned to her room and resumed playing. However, the next morning, when Peppa entered the kitchen, the situation repeated itself. This time, the copy was dressed differently, and there was something off about her. Her smile was wider and her eyes brighter. She stood at the table, staring at Peppa. Peppa froze. "Mom!" she shouted again, but Mummy Pig didn't notice anything strange. Everything seemed fine. Peppa began to fear that her imagination was playing tricks on her, but the strange occurrences continued. Every morning, when she entered the kitchen or the living room, she would see a new copy of herself. They looked similar, but each time something changed. One copy was slightly taller, another had a more vacant, strange expression on her face. Sometimes they just stood there watching. and other times they would mimic Peppa's actions. Peppa tried to ignore them, but the more she did, the more they appeared. One evening, after Peppa returned from the garden, she heard someone laughing in her room. It was her laugh, but with an unsettling edge to it. Peppa walked into the room and saw a group of her copies. They were all sitting, watching her and giggling. Each copy was slightly different from the last, and their laughter had taken on an eerie quality. Peppa felt a chill down her spine and tried to leave, but the door was locked. She was trapped. The copies began moving toward her, mimicking her every movement, as if they were her, but with something darker in their eyes. "You can't leave," one of the copies said. "We are all part of you." Peppa was terrified. She tried to escape, but no door would open. Everything felt like a nightmare. Each copy seemed to want to replace her. Soon, all the copies disappeared. Peppa woke up in her room. She wasn't sure if it had been a dream or reality, but she definitely felt that something was wrong. The next morning, Peppa woke up and, as usual, went to the kitchen. But her heart stopped when she saw that sitting at the table was a new copy of herself. This one had an even stranger smile and eyes.